The Department for Work and Pensions is moving with unexpected speed and urgency, and tonight's development has already sent shockwaves across the United Kingdom because 3 of the country's biggest and most trusted banks have now been pushed directly into the spotlight, with officials confirming that immediate action is underway that could transform the way pensioners access and manage their money, and for the millions of people who depend on their pensions not only to survive but to cover every bill, every meal, every essential cost week after week. This is not some abstract announcement to be taken lightly, but a real and pressing change with consequences that may be felt almost immediately. And the warning is clear because the Department for Work and Pensions is no longer simply dealing with policy papers, reports, or long-term strategies. It is now directing its focus onto the banking system itself, and that shift in focus could bring with it severe repercussions for ordinary pensioners who have spent decades working, contributing, and paying into the system with the promise of security in later life. And what makes this moment particularly striking is that what is happening is not a distant proposal, not a vague rumor whispered about in political circles, and certainly not a reform that will take years before it reaches the public, but rather an urgent reality that could affect the very next withdrawal a pensioner tries to make, the next bill they need to pay, or even the overall stability of the account where their pension is deposited, because the Department for Work and Pensions has been under unrelenting pressure to address fraud, to prevent overpayments, and to clamp down on what it describes as irregularities within the welfare system. And while these goals may sound reasonable, the fact that the department has now chosen to act against 3 major banks simultaneously reveals the depth of its concerns and the scale of the measures it is willing to impose. And if you are among the millions of pensioners who depend on these institutions for straightforward access to your money, then these developments are personal, not theoretical. Because pensioners are already facing some of the harshest financial conditions in decades as the cost of living crisis continues, as energy prices remain high, and as inflation stretches every single pound further than it was ever meant to go. And in that context, the last thing pensioners need is another layer of uncertainty or difficulty when attempting to access the money they are fully entitled to. Yet this is precisely the situation that is now unfolding, and so naturally the question on the minds of many pensioners is whether their pensions will be delayed, disrupted, or restricted in ways they cannot anticipate and cannot control. And the uncomfortable reality is that this is more than a subtle policy adjustment. It is a direct and explicit warning of what may be coming next, because the Department for Work and Pensions has stated in no uncertain terms that enforcement will be tightened, monitoring will increase, and banks will be expected to comply with demands that will inevitably affect the day-to-day transactions of pensioners everywhere, whether that means stricter checks at the point of withdrawal, payments frozen while compliance reviews take place, or tougher restrictions designed to eliminate potential errors. The truth is that pensioners must be prepared for consequences that could strike immediately and without much warning. And this is why the situation feels so urgent, because what is happening between the Department for Work and Pensions and 3 of the United Kingdom's largest banks is not about faceless bureaucratic machinery or technical systems hidden away from public view. It is about real people, real retirees, and real risks that could unfold in the weeks and months ahead. And for anyone who has ever felt that pensioners are treated as the easiest targets whenever the government seeks to tighten control or cut costs, what is happening right now will only strengthen that feeling, because for generations, pensioners have placed their trust in the banking system to safeguard the money that they worked for and contributed toward throughout their working lives, paying taxes, paying national insurance, and doing so in the belief that their retirement would be secure. But now that trust is being tested like never before, because while the Department for Work and Pensions insists that its priority is to crack down on fraud, to recover overpayments, and to reduce what it describes as abuse of the system, the uncomfortable truth is that ordinary, law-abiding pensioners are often the ones who find themselves caught in the crossfire of such aggressive measures, and the banks now under scrutiny, which have not yet been named publicly, are precisely the institutions most widely used by pensioners across Britain. Whether in small rural towns where the local branch might be the only one available for miles around, or in major cities where queues at cash machines are a daily sight. And the reality is that when these banks are pressured by the Department for Work and Pensions to tighten their procedures, those changes inevitably spill over into the lives of pensioners who simply want to withdraw their money, pay their bills, or send a modest transfer to a relative. And again, this is not speculation because the pattern already exists. As over recent years, many pensioners have seen their benefits paused for review. Some have been told to provide multiple forms of identification or further proof of residency, and others have had their accounts frozen under what are called compliance checks. And for someone with spare savings, such experiences may be frustrating, but for a pensioner who depends on every penny of their pension just to survive, such obstacles can mean being unable to buy food, unable to heat their home, or unable to afford the bus fare to visit a doctor. And that is why the announcement that 3 banks are now being targeted by the Department for Work and Pensions carries such weight, because it suggests that these sorts of compliance checks could soon become routine, forcing pensioners into scenarios where they arrive at a branch only to be told their pension has been delayed or is under review, or where they try to withdraw a small sum only to see their transaction declined. And while this might sound hypothetical, many pensioners are already experiencing this reality, and under a wider crackdown it is likely to spread more quickly. And part of what makes this situation so pressing is the wider backdrop, because the government is already facing mounting pressure over the triple lock on state pensions, over questions of affordability in public spending, and over the growing number of pensioners who are living in or near poverty, while banks at the same time are closing branches, pushing digital services, and reducing face-to-face contact, making life more difficult for older customers who are not comfortable online. And when these forces combine, pensioners are left squeezed from both sides, by a government that is clamping down harder than ever and by banks that are becoming less accessible and less personal. And this combination creates the dangerous circumstances that make the current warning so serious, because if a pensioner's well-being depends on a smooth and uninterrupted link between the Department for Work and Pensions and their bank, then any disruption, whether through investigation, compliance freezes, or technical delays, strikes them immediately and directly in their finances. And what compounds the situation further is that when disruptions occur, they are rarely explained clearly, leaving pensioners waiting for hours on helplines, passed from one department to another, or receiving official letters filled with technical jargon that only add to their confusion, all while they sit in their homes wondering how to pay for food, how to heat the house, and how to afford the essentials of daily life. And though the department insists these measures are about protecting taxpayer money and preventing fraud, the reality is that pensioners are the ones suffering the impact, and examples abound of pensioners accused of errors they did not commit, asked to repay thousands of pounds because of mistakes in calculations made by the system itself. And now that banks are being drawn into this crackdown, the concern is that pensioners will face even tougher obstacles to reach the money that belongs to them, and the broader consequences could be devastating, because if pensioners across the country begin to experience delays in receiving their money, then food banks will be overwhelmed, charities and councils will be pushed to their limits, and families who are already struggling with their own financial burdens will be forced to step in to cover costs for elderly relatives. And beyond that lies the issue of trust, because once pensioners begin to feel that their money is unsafe, that their account could be frozen at any moment, confidence in the system collapses, leading many to withdraw cash in larger amounts, to keep savings at home, and to expose themselves to theft or scams simply because they no longer trust the link between the Department for Work and Pensions and the banks. And this creates a situation driven by fear rather than security, and no pensioner who has worked a lifetime deserves to live with that fear. Yet that is the risk that now looms, and to fully understand why this is happening, one must step back and consider the bigger picture, because the Department for Work and Pensions has for years been criticized for billions of pounds lost to fraud and error, with mounting political pressure demanding action. But rather than addressing the deeper structural flaws in its own systems, the department has instead pushed responsibility onto the banks, demanding that they adopt tougher enforcement, report more transactions, and freeze more accounts whenever anything appears suspicious. But the danger is that what looks suspicious to a computer system may in fact be an ordinary action in everyday life, like a pensioner sending a small transfer to a grandchild, or withdrawing a larger amount of cash to cover a home repair. Yet such actions may trigger alerts, leading to accounts being frozen and pensioners being subjected to stress and humiliation as they are asked to justify completely normal behavior. And the emotional toll of this cannot be overstated, because imagine being in your 70s or 80s, trying to enjoy the retirement you worked so hard for, only to find yourself suddenly treated as though you have done something wrong, receiving cold official letters, being asked to provide explanations for every movement of your own money, and feeling humiliated and powerless. And this is the reality many pensioners now fear as the crackdown spreads across the banks. And with those fears growing louder, the pressing question is what happens next. Will this lead to widespread disruption across the country? Will pensioners face an ever-increasing number of hoops to jump through just to reach money that legally belongs to them? And what can pensioners do now to protect themselves? And the uncomfortable answer is that no one can predict with certainty how far The Department for Work and Pensions will push its demands or how aggressively banks will enforce them, but what is absolutely clear is that pensioners must remain alert, must remain informed, and must not be caught off guard, because the last thing anyone wants is to wake up one morning, walk to a cash machine, and discover that the money they rely on is simply not there, and that is why this story must be followed closely, because the stakes could not be higher. The decisions being made today will shape not only the financial stability of millions of pensioners but also the very trust between citizens, banks, and government that underpins the system, and if that trust is broken then the consequences will last for years to come, and so pensioners, families, and communities alike must pay attention, because the unfolding crackdown is not a distant debate, it is happening right now. And its effects could be felt in every town, every city, and every household that depends on the security of a pension. And that is why we will continue to watch every new development as it emerges, because the stakes for Britain's pensioners are far too high to ignore.